Hey everyone, I'm really looking forward to today's episode. I've written something interesting, maybe even one of the most surprising historical twists you'll hear. So before you get comfortable, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, and let's get started. Before there was a United States, before independence had a signature, there were two people, separated by distance, holding each other together with ink and paper. But could private letters really shape public history? Long before he became known as John Adams, he was simply John, a young lawyer in Massachusetts trying to make his way in a world that didn't hand out influence easily. He was serious, sometimes stubborn, often intense. He worried about reputation. He worried about justice. He worried about whether he would ever truly matter. Then he met Abigail Adams. Abigail was different from most women of her time. Not because she was loud, she wasn't. Not because she demanded attention, she didn't. She thought deeply. She read constantly. She listened carefully before she spoke. When they began exchanging letters, something rare happened. Their affection grew through conversation. They teased one another. They debated ideas. They respected each other's minds. This was not a marriage built only on romance. It was built on intellectual companionship. They genuinely liked talking to each other, and that would become their greatest strength. Because the years ahead would test more than love. They would test endurance. Tension with Britain didn't explode overnight. It crept in. New taxes, new restrictions, constant reminders that the colonies weren't fully in control of their own future. In Boston, frustration simmered. John's legal work drew him closer to political conflict. He believed in law, in fairness, even when emotions ran high. Then came the Boston Massacre. When John chose to defend the British soldiers in court, many were shocked. Some were angry. Why defend men accused of killing colonists? Because he believed justice must remain steady, even in chaos. Abigail understood this about him. She may not have agreed with every detail. She may have felt social pressure, but she knew the core of his character. In their letters, she didn't simply comfort him. She analyzed, she questioned, she challenged. Their relationship wasn't fragile. It could handle disagreement. And as unrest deepened, their letters became more serious, more thoughtful, more aware that something irreversible might be approaching. Did they sense that the ground beneath them was already shifting? Or did history still feel distant then? In 1774, John was chosen to attend the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. It was an honor. It was also the beginning of distance. Travel took weeks. Communication relied entirely on letters carried by uncertain routes. Abigail remained in Massachusetts with their children. The farm still needed tending. Life demanded attention. But the emotional weight had changed. Now their letters carried more than affection. John wrote about heated debates among delegates. Some demanded independence. Others urged patience. Some feared war would destroy everything they loved. He confessed frustration. He confessed determination. Abigail wrote back, describing the atmosphere at home. Rumors, tension, growing fear that armed conflict was no longer avoidable. When fighting finally broke out in 1775 and the revolution truly began, distance stopped feeling temporary. It felt dangerous. Gunfire could now reach towns near their home. Supplies grew uncertain. Safety felt fragile. And still, they wrote, because letters were the only bridge between them. And perhaps without fully realizing it, those letters did more than maintain a marriage. They strengthened resolve.
They clarified purpose. They shaped conviction. If Abigail had not written back with such steadiness, if she had not questioned, encouraged, and supported him, would John have stood as firmly when the moment for independence finally arrived? Or did a revolution quietly begin in ink long before it was declared in public? Spring of 1775. The air in Massachusetts felt different. Not louder, not yet violent, just heavy. People spoke in lowered voices. Doors closed quickly. Riders passed through towns carrying rumors faster than horses themselves. Then one morning, the rumors became reality. Gunfire at Lexington, smoke near Concord. The war that had been debated in pamphlets and taverns was no longer theoretical. The American Revolution had begun. Abigail stood near the windows of their home in Braintree, watching distant movement through a spyglass. Smoke rose beyond the trees. Faintly, she could hear cannon fire. John was not there. He was in Philadelphia. Distance was no longer romantic or philosophical. It was frightening. How do you remain calm when your children ask what those sounds are? How do you explain war to a child? She wrote to him anyway. Steady handwriting, measured tone. But between the lines, tension lingered. She told him about the militia gathering, neighbors preparing, managing supplies, fear that British troops might march further inland. She did not collapse into panic on paper, but she did not hide reality either. Was she trying to protect him from worry, or was she reminding him exactly what was at stake?
Wars are often remembered through battles and generals, but most wars are carried quietly by people who never fire a weapon. While John debated independence with delegates, Abigail managed the farm. She oversaw planting and harvest, negotiated prices, monitored shortages, treated illness during outbreaks. She even inoculated herself and her children against smallpox, a terrifying decision at the time. Think about that. While her husband helped shape a nation, she was fighting a different kind of battle at home. She once wrote that she had no time for grief. There were cows to tend, children to educate, accounts to settle. And yet evenings still found her writing thoughtful letters about politics, law, and philosophy. She challenged him. She pushed him. In March 1776, she wrote the now famous line urging him to remember the ladies when new laws were drafted. She wasn't joking. She understood something fundamental. If a new nation was born, who would it truly belong to? Did John fully grasp the boldness of what she was asking? Or was he, like many men of his time, supportive in affection but cautious in action? In Philadelphia, John Adams was exhausted. The Continental Congress was tense. Delegates argued constantly. Some feared war would destroy everything. Others believed independence was the only path left. John was not universally liked. He was blunt, intense, impatient. But he was convinced. Still, conviction does not erase doubt. At night, when debate ended and the room grew quiet, he wrote to Abigail. He admitted frustration. He confessed uncertainty. He spoke of loneliness. He missed her voice, not just her comfort, but her judgment. He trusted her mind. Their letters were not shallow exchanges of affection. They were working conversations between equals, navigating history together. That partnership mattered more than most history books ever admit. By the summer of 1776, the question could no longer be postponed. Should the colonies declare independence? The risk was enormous. If Britain won, the men signing that document would be executed for treason. John knew this. He also knew there was no turning back. When the Declaration of Independence was finalized, he felt awe and dread. He wrote to Abigail predicting future generations would celebrate with fireworks, bells, and bonfires. But in 1776, there were no celebrations. There was war, wounded soldiers, empty chairs at family tables. Abigail read his letters while managing shortages, illness, and uncertainty. Independence had been declared, but independence does not immediately create peace. It creates responsibility. It creates sacrifice. And as the ink dried on that declaration, one quiet question lingered between husband and wife. Freedom had been chosen, but would it cost them more than they were prepared to give?
John had imagined future celebrations. He truly had. In one letter, he predicted independence would be remembered with pride. But in 1776, reality was harsher. There was hunger. Wounded soldiers limped home. Mothers waited for letters that never arrived. British ships moved along the coast. Supplies were unpredictable. Inflation made basic goods painfully expensive. Every knock at the door brought uncertainty. Was it a messenger, a neighbor in need, or worse? And still, Abigail wrote to John with remarkable steadiness. She described daily life in detail: prices, weather, community morale, illness spreading through towns. These were not trivial updates. They were reports from the emotional front lines of a revolution. Do we underestimate how much those details strengthened him? Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the weight of leadership settled heavily on John Adams. The Continental Congress was no longer debating separation. That decision had been made. Now they had to survive it. Funding an army, managing alliances, preventing collapse. It's easy to romanticize revolution. It's much harder to govern during one. John often felt isolated. He was respected, but not always admired. His direct manner created friction. His impatience sometimes alienated allies. In private letters to Abigail, he admitted fatigue. He missed the rhythm of home, the predictable quiet of farm life, the presence of his children, the clarity of Abigail's perspective. He once wrote that her letters were his greatest consolation. Think about that. In the middle of war, amid political chaos, his greatest comfort was ink on paper from his wife. How many of us recognize the emotional infrastructure behind public leadership? Back in Massachusetts, Abigail's role quietly evolved. Neighbors sought her advice. She managed complex financial decisions, negotiated with merchants, made medical choices during outbreaks. She was not merely surviving, she was leading, in a way history rarely headlines. Yet she did not portray herself as heroic. In letters, she confessed exhaustion. She admitted fear for John's safety. She worried about raising children in a world defined by conflict. But she never asked him to abandon his duty. That is important. She questioned him, challenged him, pushed him to consider women's rights, but she never demanded that he choose family over country. Why? Did she believe deeply enough in the cause to share the burden willingly? Or did she simply understand that history had already set its course? Perhaps both. Long separations change people. Years apart reshape marriages. Letters maintain connection, but they cannot replace presence. Their children grew while John was away. Illness came and went. Crops succeeded and failed. Entire seasons passed without reunion. At times, Abigail's tone sharpened. She reminded him how much responsibility she carried alone. She expressed frustration at political indecision. At times, John grew defensive. He felt misunderstood. They were not perfect. They disagreed, misread each other's tone, but they always returned to honesty. That may have been their greatest strength. Not blind admiration, not silent obedience, honest conversation. By the late 1770s, the war dragged on. Victory was not guaranteed. Morale fluctuated. Soldiers deserted. Funding dried up. Foreign alliances remained fragile. Abigail could not see the debates in Congress. John could not see the daily hardships at home. Yet, through their letters, they built a bridge across uncertainty. Their words did more than maintain affection. They reinforced purpose. They reminded each other why sacrifice mattered. And perhaps most importantly, they prevented isolation from becoming despair. Revolution is often told as a story of armies and declarations, but beneath it were quieter forces: patience, intellect, resilience, partnership. Without those, would bold signatures on parchment have been enough? Could their partnership have survived if either of them had been less candid? Independence had been declared. The United States was still just a fragile idea on paper. Thousands of miles now separated husband and wife, yet their letters carried not only love, but the burden of a nation. Could their bond survive politics, distance, and history itself? The sea stretched endlessly before John Adams. Gray waves rippled under a pale sky, the wind tugging at the sails as if testing the resolve of everyone aboard. Every creak of the ship, every gust of wind reminded him that he had left behind everything familiar: the rolling fields of Massachusetts, the laughter of his children, the quiet wisdom of Abigail's presence. The voyage was not just physical, it was symbolic. He was leaving home to represent a new nation, unproven, fragile, and vulnerable on the global stage. Each wave seemed to echo the uncertainty of this journey. He held tightly to a stack of Abigail's letters, reading and rereading them, as though her words themselves could
dearest
guide
sister,
him through treacherous
The
waters.
children are well.
Abigail, standing on the shore, pressed her hands to her chest as she watched the ship recede. Pride mingled with fear. Fear for John's safety. Fear for their children growing up without him nearby. And beneath it all, the silent dread of what awaited both of them in the unknown challenges of a continent far away. The letters
Neighbor,
now
the council
were
must
more
hear
than
of this.
expressions of love.
I agree, the
They
children
were
see the trouble.
lifelines,
John will
carrying
know what to
practical
do.
advice, encouragement, philosophical debate, and the kind of moral guidance that could shape the choices of a fledgling diplomat. Every word mattered. Every line could make a difference, not just for their hearts, but for a nation still finding its footing. Europe was dazzling and strange. Palaces
Gentlemen, the French
glittered with
situation grows dire.
chandeliers.
Indeed, Mr.
Salons
President, we must
buzzed
respond.
with conversation.
Abigail's counsel is in these
Every
letters.
gesture,
John,
every
your words
bow
weigh heavy on my
carried
mind.
weight John had never
The soil needs more
navigated
care,
before.
neighbor. Thank you, Abigail. I'll try
Diplomacy
that.
demanded
I'm getting the water,
patience,
and I'll sweep the
polish,
floor.
and careful reasoning.
This letter
Yet
is for you,
every day
from
felt
John.
like a test of endurance, intellect, and nerves. In the quiet of his chambers, John opened a desk drawer and retrieved Abigail's latest letter. Comforting, yet sharper than he remembered. Honest, candid, and wise. She described the farm, the children, neighbors' observations, and offered insights into political maneuvering, subtle warnings, reflections on human nature he could not ignore. "Dearest Abigail," he wrote in reply, I walk through gilded halls, yet my mind constantly returns to you, to the home we left behind, to the children who remind me of what we fight for. Her letters became more than messages, they were counsel. They reminded him to hold on to moral clarity, to consider consequences of every negotiation, to balance ambition with humanity. Across the Atlantic, emotional and intellectual distance could have been crippling, yet their correspondence strengthened them both, grounding decisions in personal responsibility and ethical reflection. Even in the grandeur of European courts, John felt Abigail's absence acutely. Every political success felt smaller if it could not be shared. Every setback became heavier when weighed against the silent strength of a wife managing the home front alone.
The Atlantic was merciless. Waves rose like mountains. Wind howled across decks. Letters often lost or delayed in the chaos of travel. John experienced fear, exhaustion, and the humbling force of nature. Meanwhile, Abigail faced storms of a different kind. Crops failed or threatened to fail. Illness visited the children. Day-to-day survival pressed down relentlessly. She managed accounts, attended neighbors, tended the sick, educated her children, all while keeping a keen eye on the unfolding revolution. Every letter she sent was measured, offering emotional comfort and strategic insight. "The days are long," she wrote, "yet each one must be met with clarity of thought and steadiness of action. Do not forget the lessons we have learned at home, even as you navigate foreign halls of power." Letters became bridges between worlds, one tumultuous, one disciplined but lonely. And through these letters, love transformed into endurance. Distance, paradoxically, amplified intimacy and the weight of their connection. Could a partnership survive thousands of miles, endless uncertainty, and the pressures of history? They discovered that it could, but only if built on respect, challenge, and shared purpose. Every day in Europe, John navigated delicate currents of diplomacy. He negotiated treaties, appealed for aid, argued for recognition of a nation barely existing. At home, revolution raged. Supplies dwindled, soldiers suffered, families lived in fear. Abigail's letters kept him tethered to the human consequences of political decisions. They reminded him that behind policy were mothers, fathers, children, ordinary people whose lives would be forever altered by distant choices. "Remember," she wrote, "that freedom is more than words on parchment. It is lives lived with courage, patience, and love." Love and politics were inseparable. Every choice John made in Paris or London had repercussions in Massachusetts. Every insight Abigail offered influenced diplomacy, subtly but powerfully. Their partnership had become more than emotional sustenance. It was a quiet, indispensable force guiding the path of revolution. Months stretched on, letters crossing oceans on uncertain winds. Each envelope carried love, critique, guidance, moral clarity. Ink became more than words. It became strategy, reflection, a reminder of what was worth fighting for. "I feel your absence every day," Abigail wrote, "yet your presence lingers in the decisions you make and the courage you carry. Remember, we are bound not just by love, but by duty." John's replies were vivid: political frustration, small victories, personal doubt, and longing. Every line acknowledged not just Abigail's emotional support, but her intellectual partnership. Across continents, letters documented the intertwining of personal devotion and national purpose. In quiet moments between diplomacy and revolutionary chaos, they were each other's anchor.
Time passed. Small victories, letters arriving safely, successful negotiations, children growing despite separation, became moments of quiet triumph. Abigail observed, advised, nurtured, challenged. John acted, negotiated, learned, endured. Together, across the ocean, they carried the emotional and intellectual weight of revolution. This was not battlefield heroism. It was subtler, sustaining love, partnership, and moral clarity while history demanded everything from them. Through it all, one silent question lingered. Could love survive history itself? By the late 1770s, John Adams had settled into his role as America's diplomat abroad. Europe was magnificent and alien. Palaces gleamed, courts whispered secrets, and every meeting demanded calculation, poise, and endurance. Every word could carry the weight of a nation not yet recognized. Yet every night he opened Abigail's letters. More than news, counsel, comfort, challenge. Her writing kept him grounded. He felt distance in every sentence, yet also the intimacy of her insight, the moral compass of her advice. "Do not lose yourself in the pageantry of foreign courts," she wrote, "nor forget the principles for which we risk everything. Temper pride with reason and ambition with conscience." At home, Abigail bore her own trials, managing the farm, guiding children, coping with shortages, confronting illness. Yet in every challenge, she wrote with clarity, wit, and unshakable intellect. Across the Atlantic, John began to understand leadership was not only victories and treaties, it was partnership, patience, and enduring human connection. Every decision, every negotiation, informed by the steady wisdom of Abigail's letters. Their revolution was not only political, it was relational. They co-architected nation and family, quietly shaping history. As years passed, John Adams's responsibilities multiplied, negotiating treaties, building alliances, returning home only to confront the complexities of a young nation. Glory was tempered by harsh realities. Abigail remained constant. Her letters grew longer, pointed, and necessary. She wrote of children growing, neighbors navigating challenges, and the moral imperatives of leadership. "History," she once wrote, "is not only in the actions of men in distant halls, it is in the quiet daily choices we make. Lead with integrity and remember those whose voices are often unheard." Through letters, they remained intertwined, emotionally, intellectually, morally. Distance, danger, responsibility could never sever the bonds sustaining both the marriage and the nation's fragile future. By the time John became president, their partnership had matured into something extraordinary. Not dramatized heroism, resilience, thoughtfulness, unshakable commitment. Every public action informed by private counsel. Every choice bore the invisible weight of their shared wisdom. Abigail's voice, confident, honest, human, shaped not only the man, but the policies he enacted, the nation he guided, and a legacy enduring far beyond them both.
History often remembers battles, treaties, and declarations. It rarely honors the letters that guided them, the quiet courage of those managing life behind the scenes, or the emotional labor underpinning monumental decisions. The letters between John and Abigail Adams were not mere expressions of affection. They were instruments of intellect, courage, and moral guidance. Strategy and sentiment, criticism and comfort, crossing oceans and years. We can imagine John in a quiet chamber in Europe, reading Abigail's words late at night, feeling both the weight of a new nation and the steady pull of love.
Abigail in Massachusetts, balancing fear, hope, and duty, knowing her words shaped history as much as her husband's decisions did. Together, they remind us history is human. Love can coexist with duty. Letters, ordinary ink on paper, can become extraordinary lifelines, shaping nations while carrying the pulse of the heart.
Homecoming and the weight of a nation. John Adams stepped onto the dock at Boston Harbor, the salty wind tugging at his coat, the cries of children running along the shore cutting through the quiet morning. He had been away for years, traversing oceans, navigating foreign courts, carrying the fragile threads of a new nation in his hands. Every step on familiar earth felt strange. Streets seemed narrower, the air heavier, and yet, in Abigail's embrace, he found the grounding he had missed for so long. Abigail had grown too. Silver streaked her hair, hands lined from years of labor, yet her eyes retained that sharp intelligence that had first drawn him decades ago. She did not rush into dramatics. Instead, she met his gaze. In that silence, 1,000 letters, conversations, and unspoken thoughts passed between them. The house behind her carried the residue of their absence. Children grown, chores multiplied, neighbors relying on her steadiness. John knew the battles of politics would demand him again soon, but here, in the harbor breeze, he felt the weight of something more intimate, the quiet labor of love, trust, and partnership that had sustained him across continents. Their letters were no longer merely words on paper. They had become a map of endurance, a bridge between oceans, and a record of a life lived both publicly and privately with purpose. Life had shifted subtly while John was away. Abigail moved through each day with rhythm dictated by duty, care, and observation. She watched seasons change over their farm, noting crops, skies, and neighbors leaning on her quietly. Her mind never idle. Every decision she made had ripple effects, subtle but enduring. Every letter she sent carried counsel and insight. Her words were never mere comfort. They were firm, intelligent, sometimes teasing, occasionally critical, and always rooted in moral clarity. "Remember," she wrote one evening as candlelight flickered across her desk, "the future is shaped as much by our character as by our ambition. Lead wisely, but never forget the lives that will bear the cost of your decisions." John read her letters in the solitude of his office, the soft scratch of pen on paper echoing across empty chambers. He laughed quietly at her wit, reflected deeply on her reasoning, sometimes pausing to imagine her walking among the children, gaze sharp, hands steady, mind alert. She was both anchor and compass, the quiet force shaping not just their home, but the choices of a nation still fragile in its infancy. As president, John Adams balanced expectations, ideals, and relentless scrutiny. Streets buzzed with urgency, Couriers arrived with intelligence from distant states, and every decision seemed to carry the weight of life and death, not just for policies, but for the soul of a fledgling country. In moments of isolation, he turned to Abigail's letters. Her voice, calm, deliberate, reminded him of the human lives behind each political maneuver. She wrote of neighbors, of children learning responsibility, of the ethical threads binding society together. Her reflections cut through the noise, clarifying what was worth pursuing and what was mere distraction. Even amid public ceremonies, formal dinners, diplomatic negotiations, John paused to read her words. They reminded him leadership was more than strategy, it was stewardship. Every policy could ripple through lives he might never meet. Every choice demanded moral anchoring. In a world obsessed with power and precedent, Abigail's voice became his quiet conscience, sustaining him when applause and criticism clashed with the reality of responsibility.
Night fell over the city. John found himself alone with candlelight and Abigail's latest letters. The sounds of the house softened, footsteps of servants, distant carriage wheels, wind sighing across rooftops. He read her words slowly, savoring meaning and tone, imagining her pen tracing phrases in lamplight hundreds of miles away. Her letters spoke of children growing into adolescence, of small victories and frustrations of daily life, of neighbors and friends navigating uncertainty. And always she returned to a principle guiding them since their earliest correspondence. Duty without humanity is hollow. Love without responsibility cannot endure. In these quiet hours, John felt triumph and humility. He had shaped policy, negotiated alliances, helped secure a nation's foundation. Yet the greatest lessons, patience, moral clarity, the power of partnership, came through the intimate voice of his wife, whose counsel was invisible to the world, but indispensable to history itself. Time moved relentlessly. Letters became archives. Children became adults. The nation grew, faltered, matured. John and Abigail aged together, yet often apart, connected through ink and memory more than proximity. Each letter was a testament to endurance, intellect, and love. Abigail's voice, calm, incisive, shaped more than decisions. It shaped character, resilience, and the conscience of a nation. John, in quiet chambers, realized history was not only battles and declarations, but the daily, persistent human work of sustaining morality, partnership, and care. In their correspondence, personal became public, intimate became monumental, and the ordinary lives of two individuals became inseparable from the extraordinary story of a nation. Even decades later, the letters endure, reminding us that love, wisdom, and courage often flow silently across oceans, unseen, yet shaping history as surely as ink on a treaty or the signatures of founders. And in that silence, the question remains, can a nation, like a relationship, truly survive without both courage and connection?